have government provide physical and human capital. The other two types of government spending are transfer spending, welfare programs, things like that, pension programs, and consumption spending, which is government financing things like health care and things like that. Now, if you look at all the academic research about these four types of government spending, again, public goods, capital spending, transfer spending, and consumption spending, if you look at all the academic research, you will find that transfer spending and consumption spending are unambiguously bad for economic growth. The more transfer spending and consumption spending a country has, the less competitive it is going to be, the fewer jobs it's going to create. Public goods spending on these things like rule of law, property rights, enforcement of contracts, public safety, that tends to be associated with good economic growth. And then the physical and human capital, again, that's the challenging area, and the academic evidence is very mixed on that, in part because some countries do physical and human capital spending in the right way, and some countries do it in the wrong way. So it's very difficult when academics are doing these cross-country studies, it's very difficult to get a good measure on the quality of how the money is spent as opposed to the quantity of how it's spent. So when you think of these four different types of government spending, let's now try to figure out how does government spending affect economic growth. And let's do a little thought experiment. If you have no government spending in your economy, and I'm a libertarian, I like to fantasize about that sometimes. So if you have no government spending in your economy, what's going to happen to economic growth? Well, if you don't have any public safety, if you have no rule of law, if nobody's enforcing contracts, you're probably not going to have any economic growth. You're going to have a system of anarchy with maybe roving bandits and things like that. Nobody's going to want to produce because you never know whether somebody's just going to come and steal everything from you. So in a system where government isn't providing the right environment of property rights and the rule of law, you're not going to have any economic growth. So no government spending actually is very bad for your economy. On the other hand, once government gets too big, once government does more than provide those public goods, and once government goes beyond providing physical and human capital, well, then we see evidence that government is bad for growth. And let's go to the next slide. There's actually something in the academic literature called the Rahn curve. And it's actually named after Professor Richard Rahn, who's an adjunct fellow at the Cato Institute. And what Professor Rahn did, on this chart, the horizontal axis is government spending as a share of GDP, and the vertical axis is economic performance. And when government spending is zero, you can see that economic growth, economic performance is very weak. But when government gets too big, you get to the same point in time. So obviously there's some point on that Rahn curve. There's some point of government spending that maximizes economic growth. That's where you want to be. And there's actually a lot of academic research about this. And I should say, first, let me give a caveat. Government spending is just one of many factors that determines economic performance. Regulation, monetary policy, trade policy, labor policy, all these other things matter. But when academics do these studies, they try to isolate just the impact of government spending on economic performance. And generally speaking, the academic research says that once government spending gets above 20% of GDP, it tends to hurt performance. It tends to make the economy weaker. But I actually think those studies are wrong. I actually think that those studies exaggerate the size of government that you should have. And why is that? Well, imagine that you're a professor of public finance, and you're going to go out and do a study on all the industrialized economies of the world, and you're going to try to figure out what maximizes economic growth. Well, you're going to take France and the United States and Japan and Hong Kong and and Germany and all these other countries. You're going to put them into this statistical equation to try to figure out what maximizes growth. And you're going to maybe have 10 or 20 years of data. And what are you going to find? You're going to find, gee, what a surprise, that countries like Hong Kong and Singapore grow the fastest. And what is the size of government in Hong Kong and Singapore? It's about 20% of GDP. So what does that mean? Well, let's actually go back one slide. Let's hit backspace. If we look at this chart of the Ron curve, and you have 20% of GDP is the level where economic growth is maximized, is that really what we're finding? Maybe all we're doing is measuring the downward sloping side of the Ron curve. And let's now go 2 slides forward. One more. Actually, I didn't put that chart in, but if you go back 100 years or more, or even not 100 years, sometimes only 80 years or so, you will see that many countries around the world, including the United States, as I already mentioned, but also Germany, also France, also Japan, also Sweden. If you go back 100 years ago, they all have government spending of only about 10% of GDP. In other words, 20%, I think that research would instead show the growth maximizing level of government was more like 10% or even below. But now, having said that the overall level of government spending matters, let me go ahead and put an important qualification in there. It's not just the level of government spending, it's how efficient or how smart the government is about spending money. And the example that we always use in America is education. We spend more in America on education than any country in the world, measured in terms of per capita outlays per student. And yet we have very bad results. Not terrible results, but we have very mediocre results. If you look at these international rankings, the United States is 20 and 30 and even below that, and test scores and things like that. So we spend a lot more money than everybody else, and we get much worse results. Why? Because we make the mistake of doing this education spending, which, remember, what is education spending? It's human capital spending. Human capital spending is supposed to be good for an economy. But if you do your human capital spending in a very inefficient way through a government monopoly structure, which is how we do it in America, you get very, very poor results. And this is why, remember at the beginning of my presentation, I was talking about how it's very difficult to try to measure the efficiency of human and physical capital spending. Why? Because we all know that it's very important to have education. We all know it's very important to have good transportation. But if politicians are doing the education and doing the transportation in an inefficient, how do we actually get good results out of human and physical capital? We all want good transportation. But if politicians are giving contracts to their friends or campaign contributors, then you might have roads that cost twice as much as they should, and they might not be the roads that go where we want them to go. We have that problem in America all the time when politicians take transportation spending and they funnel it to their friends instead of to where we actually need more transportation. Now, we've talked about government spending, and we know that it certainly should be no more than 20% of GDP, and it probably actually should be down closer to 10% of GDP. And we know that government shouldn't be doing transfer and consumption spending. We know instead that government should concentrate on public goods like rule of safety, the rule of law and public safety. And we know that we should be very careful about how they do physical and human capital spending. Let's now think about how they finance that spending. Because, of course, this is very important for people in the business community, because guess what? You're the guys who pay for all this. Not all of it, but you're certainly some of the biggest taxpayers in any country are the people from the business community, the entrepreneurs, the investors, the job creators, the producers. It is you that the government all governments around the world should try to make people like you happy. Not by giving you special favors, but by getting out of the way and having a very fair and simple tax system that doesn't punish you for creating jobs and wealth. So what are the good principles of tax policy? Well, in some sense, I actually don't even agree with my own slide, because the real principles of good tax policy is to have a very small government so you don't need any income tax at all. But how many of us are going to become the Cayman Islands? So let's actually be a little bit more practical and say, okay, let's assume we're going to have an income tax. How do we want to do it? You first want to have low tax rates. You second want to make sure that you don't double tax capital, and I'll explain more about these things. Third, you want to get rid of loopholes because you want people to make decisions on the basis of what makes sense, not on the basis of what gets them a special tax break. And then you want to have the common sense notion of territorial taxation. And I understand that the government here actually made a big mistake by trying to tax on a universal or worldwide basis. That doesn't work at all. But let's go to the next slide because we're going to elaborate on these points. Why do you want a low tax rate? Well, let me give you an example that I assume you're familiar with in El Salvador. We certainly have it in the United States. How often do we see politicians saying, we need high taxes on tobacco because we don't like it when people smoke? I mean, we certainly have that in the U.S. I don't know what your tobacco taxes are here. Or maybe you have politicians saying, we need higher taxes on alcohol because we don't want people to drink too much. Now, I'm a libertarian. I don't think government should try to control our private lives, but you know what? I give the politicians an A+. I give them a very good grade for economics because they understand in those examples that the higher the tax, the less people will do of whatever is being taxed. My frustration, though, is the politicians don't apply that same lesson to taxes on work, saving, investment, risk-taking, and entrepreneurship. Those are the things that give us economic growth. If people aren't working, saving, and investing, if you don't have entrepreneurs out there creating jobs, there's no economy. And yet, where, in countries like the United States, but also many other places around the world, where are the highest taxes? The highest taxes are on the people who are doing the working and the saving and the investing. And so what I try to tell the politicians, wherever I go, you understand that high taxes on tobacco and alcohol mean less tobacco and alcohol. Why don't you understand that high taxes on work, saving, and investment mean less work, saving, and investment? It should be very simple. And also, if you have low tax rates, people are much more likely to comply with the tax law. There's a lot of tax evasion according to the international data in El Salvador. But you know what? There's a lot of tax evasion in Greece, there's a lot of tax evasion in Sweden, and there's even a good bit of tax evasion in the United States. But what do you find if you look at that academic research on tax evasion? You find that it is driven by three things. The most important factor that influences tax evasion is how high the tax rates are. When tax rates are high, people don't want to obey the law. It's that simple. If governments want better tax compliance, they need to have very low tax rates. The second thing that affects tax evasion is whether government is corrupt and inefficient. And this is a pretty good description of Greece, by the way. So if you're a Greek taxpayer and you see the government wasting money, if you see a government that's very inefficient, you're thinking, I don't want to pay taxes to those corrupt, idiotic politicians. Whereas if you have a government that's very efficient, like say Singapore or Switzerland, then tax evasion tends to be very low. Of course, they also have low tax rates, so that helps as well. And then the third thing that influences tax evasion is just how effective and efficient your tax enforcement agency is. Unfortunately, our IRS is pretty efficient in the U.S. It's probably not that efficient in El Salvador, but trust me, you don't want the American IRS in your life. Let's go to the next chart. In addition to a low tax rate, you want to make sure that you only tax income one time. And let me give you a little background on this before